Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
Under the golden haze of the setting sun, the worn edges of an old parchment map reveal secrets most of the world has long forgotten. Its ink is faded, its symbols arcane, yet its story is undeniable. Stretching across the West African coast and deep into the heart of the continent, names etched in flowing Latin, Portuguese, and Arabic whisper of kingdoms and peoples who defy the neatly packaged history taught in modern classrooms. In those delicate cartographic strokes lies a truth so disruptive, so world-shaking, that centuries of scholars, colonizers, and church officials worked tirelessly to bury it. For here, in the records of European and Arab explorers, in the writings of medieval Jewish travelers, and in the oral traditions of African elders, lies evidence that the children of ancient Israel did not vanish into myth after the fall of Jerusalem. They migrated, and many of them found their way to West Africa. The disappearance of the Israelites from the historical mainstream has long been framed as a mystery. The conventional narrative claims that after the Assyrian exile in 722 BCE and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the tribes of Israel were scattered so widely across Europe and the Middle East that their identity dissolved into surrounding cultures. Yet when you begin to trace the threads left behind by ancient maps, biblical geography, and African ethnography, a different picture emerges, one where these exiles traveled far beyond the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, settling in regions that modern historians seldom associate with biblical peoples. Some of the most intriguing clues to this forgotten migration are hidden not in archaeology sites in Israel, but on European maps drawn between the 14th and 18th centuries. When the Portuguese explorers began mapping the African coastline in the 1400s, they recorded more than just rivers and trade routes. They wrote down the names of towns, rivers, and kingdoms based on local accounts, sometimes adapting them phonetically from indigenous languages. In West Africa, these names often carried startling echoes of Hebrew words and biblical places. On maps from the 1600s, for example, one finds rivers of Juda and Kingdom of Judah along the coast of what is now Nigeria and Benin. To the untrained eye, these might be dismissed as coincidences. But the cartographers were not inventing these names out of thin air. They were transcribing what African people called their own lands. And to anyone who knew the Old Testament, Judah was a direct reference to the biblical tribe of Judah, the royal lineage of King David and Solomon. The notion that Israelites were in West Africa is not just a product of European speculation. Jewish traveler accounts, such as those recorded by the famous medieval scholar Eldad Hadani in the 9th century, speak of Jewish tribes living far to the south and west of Egypt, in lands bordering Ethiopia and beyond the Sahara. Eldad claimed descent from the tribe of Dan and described Jewish communities in Africa who followed ancient laws unchanged from the time of Moses. Although some European rabbis of the era question his stories, his descriptions align with the migration patterns that could have taken Israelites through Sudan, Chad, and into the Sahel region. The 70 CE destruction of the Second Temple by Rome scattered many Judeans as war captives across the empire, but a significant number fled southward into Egypt and Nubia, avoiding Roman control. Historical records show that Jewish communities thrived in Elephantine, an island in the Nile, centuries before this Roman catastrophe, which means there was already a migration infrastructure pointing toward Africa. From Nubia, traders, refugees, and warrior families could follow established Saharan trade routes into West Africa. The salt and gold caravans that linked North Africa to Mali and Ghana provided the perfect cover for these migrations. Blending with local communities, the Israelites could maintain aspects of their identity while adapting to their new environment. The maps of Abraham Cresques, a 14th century Major Can cartographer of Jewish heritage, are particularly telling. His famed Catalan atlas depicts West Africa not merely as a land of gold, but as home to sophisticated kingdoms with connections to biblical geography. Later maps, like those of Emmanuel Bowen in the 18th century, explicitly label regions as Judah or Jews' country, situated along the Slave Coast. These cartographic notations are not idle flourishes. They are records of what explorers, traders, and missionaries encountered, peoples whose customs, oral histories, and even physical features reminded them of biblical Hebrews. African oral traditions further reinforce the map evidence. The Yoruba of Nigeria, for example, maintains stories of an Eastern origin, with some clans tracing lineage to migrants who crossed from regions near the Red Sea. The Igbo, often called the Jews of Africa in anthropological literature, preserve customs such as circumcision on the eighth day, dietary practices resembling kosher laws, and separation of menstruating women, all reminiscent of Levitical commandments. These traditions were not borrowed from European missionaries. They predate sustained European contact by centuries. When missionaries arrived, they were often shocked to find what they considered Old Testament practices thriving in communities that had never read the Bible in European languages. The suppression of this narrative was not accidental. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European powers were deeply entrenched in the transatlantic slave trade. Acknowledging that many of the enslaved West Africans were descendants of biblical Israelites would have complicated the theological justifications for slavery. After all, the same church authorities who claimed to revere the chosen people could hardly defend the mass enslavement of their descendants. It was more convenient to frame Africa as a continent without meaningful connection to biblical history, populated by peoples in need of Christian salvation rather than restoration. This historical erasure was facilitated by selective scholarship. Early European explorers like Mungo Park, who traveled through West Africa in the late 1700s, recorded observations of local customs and names that hinted at Hebrew connections, yet such details were downplayed in later publications. Meanwhile, colonial cartography in the 19th century increasingly stripped indigenous place names in favor of European-imposed geography, wiping Juda from official maps. In missionary reports, similarities between African practices and biblical laws were often explained away as natural coincidences or the result of contact with Islamic traders, even in cases where the practices did not match Islamic norms. Yet the old maps survive, stubborn witnesses to a forgotten truth. In archives from Lisbon to London, one can still trace the evolution of West African mapping, watching as Juda appears, persists, and then vanishes under colonial redrafting. Each map is a silent testimony to a world before the Great Cover-Up, when the cartographer's pen was still guided by local testimony rather than imperial narrative. Modern genetic studies have added another layer to this puzzle. Research on the Lemba people of southern Africa, who claim Israelite descent, has shown that their male Y chromosome lineages include markers common among Jewish priestly families. While the Lemba live far from West Africa, their example demonstrates that ancient Israelite migrations into Africa were real and traceable. If priestly lineages could survive in southern Africa for centuries, then similar persistence in the West is not implausible. Understanding that Israelites lived in West Africa reshapes not only African history, but also Jewish history. It challenges Eurocentric models of the Jewish diaspora and forces a reconsideration of Africa's role in the ancient world. West African kingdoms such as Mali, Songhai, and Benin were not isolated from biblical history. They were part of the same interconnected web of migrations, trade, and cultural exchange that shaped the Mediterranean and Middle East. The evidence suggests that the lost tribes were never truly lost. They simply lived in places historians were not prepared to look. Perhaps the most compelling proof lies not in a single artifact or document, but in the convergence of sources, the maps that record Juda in Africa, the oral traditions of Eastern origins, the customs preserved for centuries without written Torahs, and the deliberate silence of colonial powers. Together, they form a mosaic of truth that is difficult to dismiss. The Israelites were in West Africa, their presence known to those who cared to look, until it became inconvenient to remember. History has a way of bending toward the narratives of the powerful, but maps are stubborn things. They freeze moments in time when truth still slipped through the cracks of empire. And in the faded ink of those ancient charts, the descendants of Israel still stand on the coasts of Africa, waiting for the world to acknowledge their place in the great story.